Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining. Hi, everyone. We'll get started. And I know there's probably more people coming in, so hopefully you won't miss too much. I'll start with the introduction, and then we will start with our presentation. So thank you again for coming. I hope you like my music selection. It was good until I changed it. So Kajanga Wellness Project, we'd like to begin off with the acknowledgement of the lands of the people of the Mississauga Scugog Island First Nation. We're thankful to be welcomed on these lands in friendship. These lands we are situated on are covered under the Williams Treaty and the traditional territory of the Mississauga, a branch of the Greater Anishinaabe Nation, including Algonquin, Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi. These lands remain home to a number of Indigenous nations and people, and we acknowledge this land out of respect for the Indigenous nations who have cared for Turtle Island, also called North America, from before the arrival of the settler peoples until this day. Most importantly, remember the history of these lands has been tainted by poor treatment and a lack of friendship with the First Nations who call them home. This history is something that we are all affected by, as we are all treaty people in Canada. And that includes many of us who have immigrated to Canada as well. We all have a shared history to reflect on, and each of us is affected by this history in different ways. Our past defines our present, but if we move forward as friends and allies, then it does not have to define our future. And I'd like to make an acknowledgement for the experiences of our community and our people in regards to anti-Black racism. I bore this quote from Akua Benjamin, who coined the phrase anti-Black racism. It's defined as policies, practices rooted in Canadian institutions such as education, the healthcare system, criminal justice system, and that mirror and reinforce beliefs, attitudes, prejudice, stereotyping, and or discrimination towards people of African Canadian descent. As we know, anti-Black racism has significantly impacted the outcomes of our community, and it begins from the time that children are born to elders. We understand that Canada has not done enough to recognize the experiences of anti-Black racism and has it on our community, and has not done enough to reconcile with our community around those issues. But we know that Black Canadians have a rich community, a rich experience within Canada, and we would like to acknowledge that. And that's why we celebrate Black History Month. It's not just to talk about the difficulties that we've experienced within Canada, but also the contributions that many Canadians have made within Canada. And also to give an opportunity to teach our young people who often don't get this history within schools, within their growing up. They don't always understand what our history has been like in Canada and even North America on Turtle Island. And so Black History Month is an opportunity for us to be able to teach that language specifically for our Black community members. So today, I'm so proud to be able to talk with you today about this very important topic. Kajanga Wellness Project, if you've not heard, is funded by Ontario Trillium Foundation, and we work in collaboration with Carrier Community Health Center. I also wanted to show this slide as a way to remind you all that Black organizations do not get funded. Recently, they just produced an article that talked about how our organizations are underfunded and not funded and often overlooked. And for us to receive this funding has been tremendous within our community. And we want to use this opportunity to be able to support our community in the best way that we can. So our focus is to really address some of the challenges that exist within our community, which is obviously, as we talked about, stem from systemic racism. We want to be able to support families within communities that are not safe, as well as communities where they experience interpersonal violence within their home. We want to be able to create connection within our community members so that they don't feel isolated And we want to be able to support families who are impacted by various of concerns, from mental health challenges to, grief and loss, family conflict, and other challenges that they may experience through financial stressors. And so our activities are focused around those goals. So we want to be able to reduce isolation through our peer-to-peer mentoring programs and providing support around accessing resources. We want to be able to promote equity by using our voice and education to be able to support that, as well as support families who are impacted by the system in so many different ways. And we also want to be able to address trauma by providing counseling and support groups, as well as outreach services, which we all provide. And today we have a very special presenter.
All right, I'm very excited to introduce today's presenter, and I do want to take the time to just thank everyone for taking time out of their busy evening to join us and learn with us as well. So Carrington Petgrave is a history and teaching student from Trent University. He sits on the Trent Teaching and Learning Advisory Committee and Trent's Student Association. He has dedicated his degree to exploring the stories of marginalized people and developing frameworks to teach these stories to a new generation of learners. As an active community leader, Kari is committed to promoting and fostering strong community relationships. And through education, he is able to strengthen these community bonds by teaching his peers and students new ideas, as well as giving them a new perception of our history and our present, as well as new ideas on how we can shape our future. So get comfortable, sit back, relax, and without further ado, Kari, take it away.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, so I am just going to pull up my little PowerPoint here. Lovely, lovely. So as Jasmine mentioned, yes, I am Carrington Petgrave. I'm a fourth year history student. And so I just wanted to share a little bit. This is a little presentation that I put together called Past and Present, a Framework for Black Resistance. So it's an annotated history of the Black Lives Matter and civil rights movement, just sort of a roadmap of walking through the studies that I've done over the past 4 years. In first year of university, I remember opening up my course schedule and seeing all of the different types of courses that were available to me. And there weren't many for history. I remember seeing history of Western Europe, history of Eastern Europe, history of Canada. And although Canadian or Black people, of course, fit into all of those categories, those weren't stories that necessarily looked like me. And I decided to myself in first year, I'm never going to study white people unless I have to. And by that, I mean, I'm not interested in telling stories where there's already excessive scholarship. And the stories of marginalized people are not given the light of day. So I wanted to explore that a little bit through our presentation here. So thank you for being here and thank you for your patience. So we're just going to get started here. Nicole already gave a land acknowledgement, but I think it's important to that we all take accountability for our place in a settler colonial nation. So I'm just gonna hop in here. I would like to respectfully acknowledge that I joined this call from the treaty and traditional territory of the Mississaugas of Scugog Island. And as we call in from our various territories, I encourage us all to recognize our First Peoples and the struggles that they have against colonization. And this is a struggle that we often share as Black and Indigenous people of color. In some capacity, that is. We thank them for their teachings about our earth and our relations, and that I hope that we are able to honor those teachings and live and embody them in our daily lives. And today I just put up this image of the medicine wheel, and I just wanted to say I'm being intentional in my honoring of the medicine wheel's teachings on introspection and ancestry in the little black section of the medicine wheel there as we go forward. I think it's particularly important to reflect on our ancestry and our shared history as we go forward. It sort of defines who we are going forward. So again, thank you for that. So I'm going to start with a quote here from Francis Fukuyama, and this is from Francis Fukuyama's book, The Demand for Dignity and the Politics of Resentment. The quote here is that real-world liberal democracies never fully live up to their underlying ideals of freedom and equity. So what's that quote all about, right? So I recently took a course called The History of the Self in my university. And the thesis of the course is that although our language about human rights is fairly new, coming out of the Declaration of Human Rights, and I believe it's 1948, the desire for acknowledgement, justice, equity, these larger themes of that document have been present in every major event in history, starting from at least 1500, from the Catholic Reformation. So we read that passage about the dawn of the Arab Spring in the early 2010s. Just a little bit more about Fukuyama before I get any further. Fukuyama is an American professor of political science. And again, his book is called Identity, the Demand for Dignity and the Politics of Resentment. Resentment here, I know it's kind of an angry term, and that's sort of not how we want to think about social justice. I remember when I started reading it for the course, I said, resentment, I don't resent anyone. And I think that once we sort of get into the meat and potatoes of the book, we'll sort of understand that resentment just comes to mean feelings, negative feelings when one is not acknowledged by the state. So anyway, continuing on, the book argues that modern debates about personal freedoms have been the backbone of most historical movements, as I said earlier. So we're just going to move on to the quote here. That begins at the 5th chapter of the book. Begins with Mohamed Bouazizi, and Mohamed Bouazizi was a Tunisian man who was revered as the martyr of the Arab Spring in the early 2010s. I was a child when this started, the Arab Spring, but I remember watching the coverage on television and being wrapped up in the idea of how a country can devolve that way, how a country can unravel that way, and how it seemed to spread. Right. Oh, and just quickly before I get too much further, I just want to acknowledge that I recognize that there are people, there are participants, and as I cannot see your lovely faces, you can feel free to leave questions in our Q&A section. If there's anything to unpack, anything we need to get through, feel free to drop those in the chat, and I will be sure to get to those as soon as possible. Anyway, so moving on, Mohamed Bouazizi. So this is the quote from Francis Fukuyama, page 42. And this is the experience that ignited the Arab Spring. So on December 17th, on December 17th, 2010, police confiscated the produce from the vegetable cart of Bouazizi, ostensibly because he did not have a permit. According to his family, he was publicly slapped by the policewoman who confiscated his electronic scales as well as spat on his face. Bouazizi went to the governor's office to complain, and the governor refused to see him. Bouazizi then doused himself in gasoline and set himself on fire, shouting, "How do you expect me to make a living?" That is a harrowing passage. It's one that shook me to my core reading it, and it was really hard to read, but in this harrowing anecdote, what Fukuyama is implying is that there's a cyclical nature of protest. There are several central tenets to sort of understanding what it means to be a marginalized person, and that these 4 central tenets that he identifies are the ones that are sort of the backbone of most social movements. He continues further, what made Bouazizi's experience all too familiar to millions of people in the Arab world was the way that he was treated by the Tunisian state. The goods on which his living depended were arbitrarily confiscated. He was publicly humiliated, and when he tried to complain and receive justice, no one would listen. The state was not treating him like a human being, that is, a moral agent worthy of the minimum amount of respect. So moving on here, we're going to go a bit more in depth into what those 4 tenets are, these 4 tenets, these 4 precursors to resistance. And here's the quote again here. I'm going to give a second to just go over that, reflect on that, before I move on to the next section and go a little bit deeper. All right, so the first one listed out there is that beginning part here where Bouazizi has his goods confiscated. And here I said that's, simply put, that is limits to success within the society. If you sort of pare it down, it's the most universal aspects of who we are and what we need as people to survive within a society are deprived from us, they are taken from us. Humans don't resist when there is not a need, right? If for anyone familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it's a visual representation of sort of the different stages of what humans desire and crave, with the lowest being air, water, food, shelter, clothing, reproduction, all of those sort of very base kind of things. In this example of Mohammed Bouazizi, when his goods were confiscated, this translates to a general sense that one's necessities are hindered, removed, lessened, diminished by an outside power. When we think of this historically, again, we think of maybe the French Revolution, that famous line, "Let them eat cake," being a French peasant resistance, as French monetary policy made it impossible for French citizens to buy bread, the most basic of necessities, the basic thing that they would feed themselves with. And of course, that led to the famous decapitation of the royal family, one of the most significant events in our recent history, as they say. So the second here is public humiliation. So Fukuyama explains that there's a profound effect of public humiliation in galvanizing people to resist. We can simplify that further to any effort to demoralize or diminish the reputation of a group of people. And to think about this historically, I think of these invented slavery myths of human zoos, of ways in which Black people were made to appear lesser. I think of probably the most fitting example for me is the story of Black people eating watermelon. And historically, that comes from after the dissolution of slavery, slaves in the South were able to start building their own businesses, and they grew watermelon. So white slave owners or former slave owners created a myth, a slavery myth, a trope that Black people were lazy and that watermelon was a symbol of their vice, while it was actually a symbol of their economic independence. But it's the ways in which these myths that we create about people carry on, and it shapes our perceptions of these groups of people. And that watermelon stereotype is one that still exists to this day. The stories we construct about people inform how they are placed and received within the larger society. When the stories we hear are negative, it has a reciprocal effect, and how we feel about these groups of people being mentioned becomes negative as well. Next here we have the lack of recourse. For Bouazizi, this was being shut out by the governor when he sought to report the officer that had slapped him in the face. Lack of recourse simply means that when injustice is done, there is no reassurance that the injustice will be remedied. And for that, I think historically of the American Revolution, there's the famous line, "No taxation without representation." It's a rallying cry for the Americans who demanded reliable political systems that would be receptive to their unique needs in a way that the British government was not period, right? So, and the last and probably the most self-explanatory is the failure to acknowledge humanity. This is the failure of a state to equally apply the law or provide equal economic opportunity to certain segments of the population. And again, historically, I think of the 3/5 Compromise of 1787, which is a legal idea that African slaves should not be counted as full persons to not throw off the vote in American democracy. So they were counted as 3/5 of one white person. Just horrifying historically, but so that's where we're going with this. So where are we with all that? With all that established, our goal now is to highlight the histories of the Black Lives Matter movement and the Civil Rights Movement using this framework proposed by Fukuyama. Again, I acknowledge that we are coming with our own experiences, our own background, our own knowledge, and my goal here is somewhat to synergize what we have learned, because one of my teaching professors once told me that a good teacher will learn 10 things about their audience before they teach one. And that's something I try and live by here. I recognize that we all carry knowledge that is important and valuable to our discussions. So if there is anything that you want to ask, anything that you want to pose in the chat, I am more than happy to throw my 2 cents in. All right, so starting here, we are going to go with the deprivation of basic needs in the civil rights era. So here I wanted to pick an example from my research, which was the Vietnam War. And Blackness is sort of erased from history in a lot of ways. The Vietnam War spanned from the 1950s to 1970s. So the Civil Rights Movement, of course, was sandwiched in there. And in many ways, the politics of the Civil Rights Movement played out in the theaters of war in Vietnam. This was a period of major upheaval. You'll see the women's movement happened in this same period, the anti-war movement, the civil rights movement, the queer liberation movement. Like the 1960s is like the hot button for that kind of social change in the Americas and sort of throughout the Western world. So according to Andrew West in his book, The World Around War, A Nation Divided, this war forced the integration of white racists who were living in the rural South to mix with Black Americans. Both races tended to live in their own ethnic enclaves. So this war forced interactions between those two demographics. So that is to say that after the end of slavery, Black people had fled to cities that were segregated under Jim Crow laws, which I'll go a bit more into the depth a little bit later. But these are basically a series of laws that separated white spaces from Black spaces. You know, those famous images of whites only water fountains, for example, and segregated schools. These are Jim Crow laws. So in the article, it says that some adult white people would go their entire lives without ever meeting a Black person, simply because they lived in such separate communities, by design, of course. So imagine these Black people coming into contact with these white racists in not only a very emotionally charged setting, but one that is very violent, one where people are under emotional distress from the war itself, ones where the white racists would be put in positions of power above Black people in a greater capacity than they would be on the mainland. And of course, giving them access to firearms. This is clearly not a good recipe for unit cohesion. And of course, critiques of Black Americans of the war were not uncommon during the period. In a famous quote by Muhammad Ali, when referring to the draft in which regular Americans would be recruited into the war, Muhammad Ali said that he had no problem with the Viet Cong, as, quote, "No Viet Cong has ever called me a nigger." Right, so he would say that his frustration with the American society was greater than any frustrations that he would have with anyone in the international community. So as part of the recruitment for the Vietnam War, there was the concept of the draft. And the draft was, again, recruiting average Americans into the war effort. In an article by Catherine Kinney, she says the draft was, quote, "an instrument of Darwinian social policy. The fittest, those of background, wit, money, managed to escape, and draftees who fought and died in the war were predominantly society's losers. The same men who got left behind in school, jobs, and other forms of social competition." In the draft, you would be able to opt out, for example, if you were a college or university student. Black students were not often given those opportunities. Black students are often barred from post-secondary institutions. So their ability to be opted out of who would serve in the war was greatly diminished. And because of that, 20% of the casualties of the Vietnam War were of Black citizens, as opposed, despite the fact that they made up 10% of the US population at the time. We also have the issue of discipline within the war. So again, in Catherine Kinney's book, Friendly Fire, American Images of the Vietnam War, Kinney argues that Black soldiers received punishments at double the rate of white soldiers for such arbitrary offenses as provoking gestures, or in the case of one soldier, for reading. These sort of implicit bias worked its way into the military life. Soldiers would be given disciplinary measures against them for what for white soldiers would often not be reported. This idea of Black impudence, of Black being uppity, sort of that comes from slavery, these ideas of a Black person not knowing their place played out in that theater of war. And the arbitrary mistreatment of Black soldiers led to 209 incidents of what is called fragging. Fragging being soldiers shooting at their commanding officers in the year of 1970 alone. From this, we come to understand that Black soldiers' success and effectiveness as soldiers were limited not only by their proximity to white racists, but by the conflict that was common amongst the soldiers themselves. The conditions in the United States set them behind white soldiers before the war even began. And then quickly going over Jim Crow laws. Again, this is probably the most obvious example of the ways in which Black folks were deprived of their daily needs. The Jim Crow laws, starting in the 1860s, were a way to prevent Black bodies from fully integrating into society after the abolition of slavery. Slaves during slavery, they would not be given shoes, the ability to read, attend schools. So they lived in an altogether separate sphere. It was illegal for them to speak to white people, and in several cases, even making eye contact with white people could be met with reciprocal violence. So, and again, the Jim Crow laws did not only exist in the United States as they are most famous. If anyone has the fairly recent minting of the $10 bill, we see Viola Desmond, who is a Nova Scotia woman who famously refused a seat in a segregated Nova Scotia theater. In America, however, these major demographic shifts took place in the Civil War, and former slaves fled north to large urban centers, and this influx of the changing population caused changes in the social makeup of an area as well. And laws came into existence to sort of legislate how Black people would be able to move through these white spaces, or spaces that had formerly been white. And this is sort of the inversion of white people moving out to the suburbs and Black people moving into the cities. And it sort of remains this way to the modern day. There's the suburb of there's the stereotype of the suburbs being very white and very affluent, and that sort of stereotype, they say that all stereotypes come from a kernel of truth, and that's sort of the historical analysis of it coming from the 1960s. So again, simply put, Jim Crow laws separated Black existence and white existence into two separate spheres that rarely intersected, and when they did, trouble was never far behind. Moving on to the deprivation of basic needs for today, the Black Lives Matter movement. I think everyone here today is vaguely aware that Black Lives Matter primarily exists to bring about police reform. But police brutality is an ever-present fear for many Black people, and there's a collective trauma around police brutality that dates back to the earliest conceptions of police forces in Canada and the US. Historically, they evolved from slave patrols that were used to find Black people who had escaped from the bondage of slavery. And even before that, in Europe, the earliest conceptions of police forces in England came into existence as the poor started to move into urban spaces to get jobs in factories, and the police were an arm to assist the rich in making sure that the poor did not raid their homes. So in general, policing has never been historically rooted in the protection of the masses, and the idea of protect and serve is a fairly recent one that is unequally applied rather. So moving on here. So what I can speak on is the Black Lives Matter movement in itself. So broadly speaking, the movement exists to defend Black lives from police brutality for such offenses as walking while Black, playing with a toy gun in a park, minor traffic infractions, and many other incidents. The movement itself began in 2013 as a hashtag following the acquittal of George Zimmerman, who was a neighborhood watchman who murdered the 17-year-old boy Trayvon Martin in Florida. The organization was started by some local community organizers, Alicia Garza, Patrice Cullers, and Opal Tameti. Their movement was strengthened and gained greater attention as more and more high-profile cases of police brutality came to light, starting with Freddie Gray in Baltimore, and Eric Garner in New York. The movement solidified and finally became an organization of resistance to police brutality, and became recognizable as it is today after the murder of Michael Brown in Ferguson. All of these protests were able to garner massive support through the use of the hashtag Black Lives Matter. In a document by Ryan Gallagher, The Black Lives Matter hashtag and the movement are described as a central axis through which conversations about human rights for Black people flow through. So that's a different way to reframe that argument there. For me, the most interesting thing about the Black Lives Matter movement is the way in which it addresses the subtle indignities associated with moving through the world as a Black person, as opposed to the sweeping legislative goals of the civil rights movement, being with their legal goal being the end to Jim Crow laws and sort of having an ordinance to create legal equality between Black and white people. In a paper I wrote about the Black Lives Matter movement, part of my research went into how decentralized the Black Lives Matter movement is, especially as it has such a strong online presence. For the civil rights movement, you know the leaders, and they partnered with the NAACP, which is a national organization advocating for the rights of Black people. Black Lives Matter doesn't necessarily operate that way. And what you'll more often see is local regional chapters of Black Lives Matter Toronto, Black Lives Matter LA, Black Lives Matter New York, etc. And each of them are able to advocate for their respective communities because they're smaller in scale. The article reads there, as a decentralized movement, many actors can appreciate the movement's phraseology and deploy it to their own goals. So the idea is that the Black Lives Matter organization and movement are two separate things, and that the movement anyone can be a part of, and not everyone sits on the organization, not everyone handles the funding and all that. Because of this, the Black Lives Matter movement has taken on an almost fluid nature, and as you've likely seen, it's organized into regional chapters. So moving on again, police brutality and the way that Black Lives Matter advocates for an end to police brutality is different depending on your locality. So what I wanted to share today about the history of Black Lives Matter is sort of campaign zero. And this was sort of the first time that I saw how online protests can work and how this sort of decentralized movement could come to become what it is today. Oh, we have a chat. Thank you, Serena. That's very sweet. So moving on here. Black Lives Matter has the unique ability to gather broad support through viral marketing and sharing of social justice content. Much in the same way, I'm not sure if anyone remembers this, for me it was a defining moment of my childhood that took the world asunder, was the Kony 2012 movement, and how it just halted the world in its tracks, how it instantly grabbed attention. And that was sort of the way that Black Lives Matter is able to move as well. In simple terms, it gathered some of the leading race scholars in the world, including the famously vest-clad activist DeRay McKesson, and they created a comprehensive campaign of policy reforms. Again, because it's such a comprehensive review, I'm not going to go through all 10 points because it goes through different policing policies from ostensibly all 50 states. And that in itself could fill our hour-and-a-half discussion here. I'm not going to do that. But what I can talk about here is the many ways that the movement has been successful, and how it brought broad attention to the ways that police will use militarization, they'll use military equipment, assault-style weapons and tactics. It brought attention to the ways in which independent investigations are not necessarily done in cases of police brutality, and ending forms of predatory policing, such as broken windows policing in communities of color. So just even adding these terms to our cultural lexicon, so we all have the language to talk about these same issues, in my view, is a major victory for Black Lives Matter. Do you think BLM's decentralized approach is more effective than the civil rights movement? That is a difficult one to answer. I think it is certainly easier to say now that the Black Lives Matter movement has been very successful and that it has reached a wider audience, and that maybe the ideals of the Black Lives Matter movement are sort of wider understood in the larger community. It's sort of hard to say because we are so early into the Black Lives Matter movement, because it only started in 2013, the way that we know it today. I think there's certainly different approaches, but I'm not sure if it's fair to say that one is more effective than the other. Maybe hindsight will tell. The next one, where are we going in Toronto? I'm not quite sure how to answer that one. As in, how is Black Lives Matter in Toronto? I'm not personally affiliated with the association. I'm not sure if someone else has an answer there.
Sorry, Kari. Yes, I believe the question was, what is
policing is sort of the idea of going to the most marginalized neighborhoods and cracking down on low risk offenses or non-violent offenses, for example, loitering, public smoking, public indecency, jaywalking, and sort of collecting tax revenue and making arrests that way. So it's the over-policing of communities where there would be broken windows of bad neighborhoods in order to develop tax revenue, as opposed to policing rich neighborhoods. In one interview I saw with a police officer, a retired police officer, he said, if you go and investigate in the suburbs, then you might end up arresting the judge's son, the lawyer's son, another police officer's son, people who have legal representation. But when you work in communities of color, places where people do not have access to the same amounts of funds, for example, to have an adequate legal defense, it's much easier for the police to collect their revenues. In some police agencies, police officers have quotas of how many infractions they crack down on and how many fines they'll give out to sort of make up their funding, their budget. So it's sort of targeting these low risk crimes in communities of color. So that's the long and short of broken windows policing. So next we have public humiliation when it comes to the civil rights movement. So I wanted to go back to what Fukuyama said about public humiliation and how it's a precursor for resistance. So here I wanted to share some of the ways that Black folks have been stigmatized for both the civil rights and Black Lives Matter movement. I wanted to start with a Canadian example of the community of Africville. This is one that I recently studied extensively in the History of the Self course. So just as a preface, Africville is a historically Black community that existed in Halifax, Nova Scotia until the 1960s. This community was home to a thriving African Canadian community who had settled on lands that were promised to them by the British Crown. During the American Revolution, lots of Black people had sided with the British, sort of fearing what would come if the Americans took over, because some policies of slavery already existed within the states, and fearing what would come with an American government. They fled with the British as they lost the war and landed in British North America, which later became Canada. So Nova Scotia was a territory that was promised to, or at least some land, not the entirety of Nova Scotia, but land in Nova Scotia was promised to African Canadians or people who became African Canadians. This community, however, was no means protected by the Canadian or British authorities and was neglected to the point of decay. So in this photo here, you can see the very clear potholes. You can see in this photo that there are no paved roads. There's no electrical lines. And this is a photo from the 1960s. This is Halifax. This is a major city in Canada. And to have what was coined a shantytown on the outskirts was incomprehensible to a lot of people. But of course, understanding the treatment of Black people internationally, it's not so hard to believe. Further, there was a lack of legal representation for the residents of Africville. So this means the community lacked the resources to protest the harmful industries that would be placed in Africville. So industries such as infectious disease hospitals and the city dump and chemical plants, the incinerator, these would all be placed in or around Africville, and the related public health risks would be most effective or affect the residents of Africville the most. residents would have to cope with the massive influx of rodents and stray dogs that came from the dump, as well as the pollutants that got into the groundwater. In one example, there's a little old woman, and she has to climb a hill in the community every day to get the water for her home. And despite the fact that it had been replaced by the city, the water came out red because of the pollution in the nearby community. So that's sort of what we call environmental racism. Environmental racism is the placement of harmful elements of the society by marginalized, racialized people, the poor. Any undesirable section of society would be placed closest to these environmental hazards. And what's also interesting about the community of Africville is what Jennifer J. Nelson describes as the racing of the slum. So Africville, again, was coded as a slum in that the buildings were not necessarily well constructed, but because of the racing of the slum, I'll just read directly here. The slum is by definition filthy, foul-smelling, wretched, rancorous, uncultivated, and lacking care. The racial slum is doubly determined for the metaphorical stigma of a black blotch on the cityscape, and it bears the added connotation of moral degeneracy, natural inferiority, and repulsiveness. So that is a long way to go back a short distance. That's to say that a Black community that is not in a good state is not that way because of mishandling by the city. It's not that way because of neglect or a lack of funding. It is that way because of the moral degeneracy, natural inferiority of the Black people that live in that community. They would say that because they lived so close to the dump that was placed there without their consent, that they became this image of like garbage pail kids as a community. So in this way, the ruin and the dilapidation of the community can be attributed to the residents rather than the racism that enabled the community to become the way that it was. In response to the mistreatment of this community, local activists at the time reached out to American civil rights activists, such as Stokely Carmichael of the Black Panther Party, and Martin Luther King himself, who was not able to attend the human rights conference that they had organized. So under the counsel of these Black activists, the residents of Africville were able to create an organization called the Black United Front. And the residents of Africville and largely Black Canadians across Canada would get together and sort of share their ideas about how they are being treated within the society. So here we sort of understand that for the civil rights movement, there's a deliberate effort they received deliberate efforts rather to discredit both the communities that the activists were coming from as well as the activists themselves. They would either paint the community as negligent or culturally inferior, or they would inflate the danger of the speaker themselves. When Black Panthers came to Canada, there was fear of armed revolution, despite the fact that that was not necessarily advocated for. But fear of Black rage, fear of what angry Black people could do was so destabilizing to the community that it required action. To move on to the Black Lives Matter movement, some of the same trends exist. For Black Lives Matter, public humiliation for the community is fairly obvious. And when I say that, I mean the ways in which Black people are taught to be feared within the society. And I don't think that today, I don't necessarily want to talk about unconscious bias. I think so much scholarship already exists about that. So what I wanted to talk about today is how public humiliation is accrued onto the organization itself in the deliberate efforts to smear the Black Lives Matter movement and misrepresent it. There's a comment in the chat. Let me go back. As soon as I could get this PowerPoint working. Perfect. There we are. Thank you very much. So next we have public humiliation for the Black Lives Matter movement. So the ways in which Black rage and Black resistance is understood in the news media and the way that it is distilled down to the public in many ways is inherently negative. In this way, we have this what I call racial gaslighting. It's emblematic of the way we understand race relations. In a way, our society even lacks the language to talk about race and resistance. So I'm just going to put on this quick little clip here. And it's an interview between Megyn Kelly and D.L. Hughley, a Black comedian and a Fox News pundit in reverse order. And this is a conversation they were having about, I believe this was the protests in Ferguson. Pay close attention to the way that Megyn Kelly dismisses the claims of D.L. Hughley in his lived experience as a Black man in America. Hopefully this link is going to work for me. And if someone in the chat could just let me know if they're seeing, actually I have it pulled up already. I don't need to open a new tab.
Hi, Kari. I'm sorry, but we're unable to see the slide or the video.
Perfect. So let me just stop the share and, oh, okay, let me put a memento for before. Oh.
White House, an oral history of the Obama years. DL, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. I didn't know Mark Furman was going to be here.
What did you make of it? Because you were shaking your head.
I think that cops will have a different perspective than us, and I think it was interesting to hear Mark Furman, who was actually got in trouble for perjuring himself, called somebody a liar. It's ridiculous.
And what do you make of the fact that she had inconsistencies in her story?
I think the cop had inconsistencies in his too. To me.
So then you let the evidence play out.
Here's my problem. It is my belief that no matter what happens, no matter what we see, the cops are given a presumption of innocence. If that same tape showed a suspect doing something, that would be all the prosecution would need. They would say the evidence is all right here. But a cop gets a presumption of innocence that is, no matter what they see, we can see somebody getting shot to death, but we don't know what happened before, we don't know what happened after. I know this, that in both these states, a lot of men in Louisiana, 50 or 47% of people carry guns. Men carry guns. So men having guns on them can't be that unusual. Why wasn't the first question, rather than assuming, do you have a permit for that? Those are states that you can carry a gun.
But you're making assumptions because we don't know what happened.
No.
What we have right now is her testimonial, which doesn't capture the actual event. Do we know whether she's credible? Do we know whether...
We know this. We know he had a permit to carry a gun.
But that doesn't answer any of the questions.
That absolutely answers the question.
If he pulled the firearm on the officer, if he didn't disclose it, if the officer felt threatened...
Why on earth would you... Here's what we do know. He had a permit to carry a gun. When you get a permit to carry a gun, they tell you exactly how to act when a police officer...
That doesn't mean he didn't threaten the officer.
You're willing to give them a presumption of innocence.
I'm not giving them presumption. Well, the law gives them the presumption of innocence.
No, their badge gives them a presumption.
We don't know the facts. We saw this happen with Michael Brown of Ferguson.
And we still don't know the facts there. We have a police officer's word and a grand jury's word.
No, we have the Department of Justice's word.
The Department of Justice shut down Ferguson. Ferguson had to be shut down because it was so corrupt.
The Department of Justice found that the police there had endemic racism. They found that.
Right.
But they also exonerated Officer Darren Wilson.
That's not
and they found Hands Up, Don't Shoot was a lie, and that Michael Brown was the aggressor.
Wow. Here's what I'll say.
Don't wow me.
Don't tell me not to wow you. I can say wow if I want to, and I'll tell you this. I'll tell you this. They found systemic racism, right? So it's unbelievable. They also found systemic racism, and we know that Darren Wilson left the department because it was so racist it had to be disbanded, and with the Ferguson, another department that is rife with racism.
So that makes him a racist.
Absolutely. You know what? I have no problem.
Michael Brown grabbed that officer's gun and tried to shoot him in his patrol car.
No one has proven that.
That's what Eric Holder's DOJ concluded.
And Eric Holder's DOJ concluded that department was so rife with
that's a dodge. I already conceded that, DL. We're talking about Michael Brown and the lie of Hands Up, Don't Shoot.
I don't dodge at all. I'm here in Fox News.
Then let's stay on it. Let's stay on Michael Brown.
No. We're talking about
We're talking about.
I'm not talking. You
don't dodge. Then let's stay in balance.
We were talking about the young man that just got murdered in Minnesota.
And the rush to judgment and the assumption you know something when you don't actually know it.
First off, what I'll tell you is this. It is not uncommon for you all to see one thing. The only place racism doesn't exist is Fox News and the police department. That's the only place. That's absolutely true.
That's insulting. You just insulted millions of people watching this channel.
And you know what? I'm insulted by the things I hear on this network, so we're even. I could care less about insulting people that insult me on a daily basis.
You're making a point that is, before the insults, the point you started to make is true, and we can talk about that whites perceive the situation when it comes to
I think a lot of people in this network
have never
seen a black man anything deserved.
Could you hold the insults for a second so we can have a productive conversation? You were going to make the points that whites see certain incidents differently than blacks do, and we saw that in the O.J. Simpson case when the verdict came down. I'll give you that. Most reasonable people will give you that. But you know what shuts down all reasonable dialogue is throwing out the term racism before it's been proven.
You know what's, first off, I'll say this. I believe that there is a benefit of the doubt given to police officers. It's not given to anybody else. And maybe, yeah, obviously they do a tough job. You can't. In 2006, the FBI came out with a report that said that police departments were rife with white supremacists. Said it, not me. So why would not believe if I know that? I don't know a black man that hasn't had a run-in with a police officer, from the highest to the lowest. So my
you've been backed up on that by many
perception of this is based on the experience I've had, just like yours are. So I am not willing to give them a benefit of the doubt. I have seen a lot of things. I lived in the city that Mark Furman Police that also had to be taken over by the federal government.
It's very dangerous when you get to the point where you paint with an entire group with the same brush based on the bad actions of it.
That is amazing to hear on this network. That really is. That really is amazing to hear on this network. The only place where
thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Take care. Also tonight, new detail.
Why the Canadian Privacy Committee?
So I'm just gonna stop the share there as we get our slide presentation back up and running. But before we go in, if anyone found any moments of that particularly moving, any examples of racial gaslighting, for me, what I saw, Kelly is the one who raises her voice. DL Hughley does not. Yet she says, "You are attacking me," and she says that is insulting. To have the mere mention of racism is insulting. That's the epitome of white fragility. The irony in her statements, yes, very much so. Just starting the screen share again here and presentation. We're just going to scroll back to where we were. There we are. She said, "We don't know, that hasn't been proven." She indicated that she was being attacked. And again, much like how we use the term Karen in our society, it's sort of a white woman who is able to capitalize on white supremacy, the presumption that a white woman is in danger when she is in a space with a black man. Automatically, she reframes the argument of she is being attacked. She is unsafe in the presence of a black man who has not raised his voice. The idea that it is insulting to be complicit in a system of white supremacy, as opposed to engaging in the content that he brought up. And I'm just going to check what is in the chat here. It's bizarre how she talked about proving racism. Exactly who has the ability to do so, if not the people that live it every day? She's been known to do this. Someone says, and very much so. It's not the first time she's done that. And someone says, as if the burden of proof is on the people being targeted somehow. You need to verify that you have experienced harm to be credited as someone who has experienced racism. I think all of those are great points, and I appreciate you sharing and engaging in that content. I recognize that it's difficult to watch. So I think that this racial gaslighting, both in how Megyn Kelly and the media does it, exists in a variety of ways. And I wanted to talk about Chris Dorner, who is a former LAPD police officer. This was a wall-to-wall news story in 2013, around the same time that the Black Lives Matter started. Dorner was a former LAPD officer, and in 2007, he reported a fellow officer for police brutality, alleging that the fellow officer had kicked a suspect in the face during a mental health crisis. in the court battle ensuing, Dorner's claims against his commanding officer were dismissed, and Dorner himself was dismissed from the LAPD on the allegation that he had made up this story and that no one had truly been harmed. Dorner then released an LAPD or a manifesto condemning the LAPD and saying that he did everything as he should. He reported when an officer was not doing the right thing and was met with reciprocal punishment. He was met in a punitive way. And this led to his going on a shooting spree and killing 5 LAPD officers in a multi-day manhunt. The news coverage regarding this incident, this horrible incident, seemed to hinge on a growing anti-cop sentiment, one that was not necessarily demonstrated, and it seemed to blame the Black Lives Matter movement in itself for the growing distrust that people had of police, as opposed to, it was attacking something I say often, it's attacking the symptom but not the cause. The reason that Black Lives Matter distrust police is because of the harm that they have experienced by the police. It is not the acknowledgement of that harm that has created anti-cop sentiment. The anti-cop sentiment existed because of the treatment by police that was nuance and context missing from the news coverage that I remember, at least. We have a comment. I remember this, and they used that incident to try and blame and chastise the BLM movement. That's right. Yeah, absolutely. And this sort of trend continued further in the 2016 Dallas ambush. So this was an attack following the 2016 murders of Alton Sterling and Philando Castile. And it took place in Dallas, Texas, during a memorial protest for the aforementioned victims. A shooter with a stated motivation to, quote, kill white people, and especially white cops, then launched an attack, shooting and harming 12 police officers. This is a tragic attack. However, it received very curious news coverage. Again, the racial gaslighting in the news coverage was overwhelming. This one, again, more recent, maybe someone remembers it as well. Despite the shooter having no affiliation to the local Dallas branch of Black Lives Matter and them publicly denouncing his actions, the connection between him and Black Lives Matter never seemed to disappear in the minds of people. And news pundits, again, cited a rising anti-police sentiment. In an interview recently, one of the siblings of one of the survivors was talking about the more recent 2020 protests for George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery. And he said something along the lines of, we need to make sure that these protests are peaceful. We need to make sure that people are voting and going through this the right way, as if the overwhelming majority of these protests did not remain peaceful. It's addressing an issue that did not necessarily exist that way. To say, much like Megyn Kelly saying, don't attack me when there was no attack, it positions the media and it positions people to sort of have this defensive stance against the justified opinions of Black people. It's a form of racial gaslighting. And there I think about the famous Martin Luther King quote, to be fearful of the white moderate, or to be wary of the white moderate. And what that quote meant is that for many white people, it's more difficult, or his quote was more that for many white people, it is more comfortable to side with what is comfortable, what is easy, as opposed to what is right. So although there is sometimes violence associated with the Black Lives Matter movement, with the harm that a community has endured, it is not the right thing to do to simply end those conversations and sort of put a nice little cap on the conversations that are happening about the injustices faced by Black people. You need to be committed to justice and not immediate peace. So that's sort of what the case of Chris Dorner and the 2016 Dallas ambush taught me about the Black Lives Matter movement and their response to public humiliation and slander. Next, we have the lack of recourse. This is the third tenet, and it's likely the last one that I'm going to talk about for our chat here today. So the lack of recourse. So Francis Fukuyama says the lack of recourse is the lack of assurance that the state will protect an aggrieved party. And here I want to talk about the ways in which the civil rights movement and Black Lives Matter movement sought to remedy the lack of recourse for their respective movements. So here I have a photo of Thurgood Marshall. Thurgood Marshall was recently played by the late, great Chadwick Boseman in the film Marshall. So Thurgood Marshall is a lawyer and later became a Supreme Court justice who fought to implement many of the most significant pieces of legislation during the civil rights period, including Brown v. Board of Education that was fought by, or argued rather, by Thurgood Marshall. In the Civil Rights Act of 1964, again, Thurgood Marshall was heavily involved. He spent his early career working in Baltimore under the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, in their Baltimore chapter. And basically, as a lawyer, he would be dispatched to places where the law was being unequally applied to Black people, in cases where Black people were being prosecuted on faulty evidence. Thurgood Marshall would be sent by the NAACP to advocate for them on their behalf when criminal lawyers either were not available or were not willing to put their best effort forward for a Black defendant. And Thurgood Marshall was very effective in doing so. He argued in front of the Supreme Court multiple times, winning 29 out of his 32 cases that were brought before the court. And I'm just going to stop for a Q&A here. Do you think major news channels like CNN and Fox are partially to blame for the reputation of the Black Lives Matter movement garnered by focusing on the few violent protests as opposed to showing the many peaceful ones? Absolutely. Not to sound Trumpian, I think the media is not necessarily interested in shaking up a system. I think that with corporate consolidation, I think it is very comfortable to basically, media companies are often run by a small number of very ultra-rich people who are not necessarily concerned with the goings-on of people lower down. And I think this is something that we see in like more in-depth studies. But there's sort of, it's very easy to side with the majority when you have nothing to lose. It's very easy when your news company does not have a large investigative journalism budget to go and investigate and send a team out to speak to Black Lives Matter activists, but it's easy and cheap to just go to the press conference, take what the police officer said and call it a day. If they say there were arrests, that's what you take. They're not necessarily going to go and find someone who is in the protest and say, I was battered by a police officer. And I think anyone that was on social media during the last summer saw the extent to which police brutality was perpetuated on the average person. There were shocking videos of police officers running through crowds of people, throwing people down. The famous video of a police officer pushing down an old man who began to bleed from his ear. These were things that were not reported the same way that the official press briefing from the police were. So I think absolutely intellectual and journalistic laziness is a huge part of the way that Black Lives Matter is perceived now. So moving back to Thurgood Marshall here. So Thurgood Marshall was again instrumental in the Brown versus Board of Education case, and that is the famous landmark case that sort of broke up segregation. It was sort of a policy to say that it was illegal to have segregated schools, and that helped break down rules of segregation international or across the US, and I suppose internationally as well. Black Americans at the time, as I had sort of mentioned earlier, the legal systems could be marshaled in the name of white supremacy to harm Black and Brown people. So having a very skilled and knowledgeable lawyer advocating for Black and Brown people in the highest court in the land was surely a great asset. Moving on to the Black Lives Matter movement, our more contemporary version here. There's a myriad of legal challenges that they have had for the justice system. And they also have a unique way to utilize social capital. And by social capital, I mean the value that comes with having the people on your side. I think that Black Lives Matter is uniquely able, as an online protest group, as a sort of to be able to reach different groups of people, and also to be able to sort of spread their message very easily. But I'm sort of getting ahead of myself. So this is sort of the last organized section that I have here today. I want to talk a little bit about George Zimmerman and sort of the lack of recourse for the Black Lives Matter movement. So George Zimmerman was famously the neighborhood watchman who murdered 17-year-old Trayvon Martin in Florida after being told by police that he should not continue to follow the young boy. Zimmerman did. He confronted Trayvon Martin in an altercation. Trayvon Martin was fatally shot and killed. Despite a very heavily televised trial, and I remember as a child, this was the first time I had ever been glued to the news, aside from yearly the little Santa Claus tracking NORAD thing. And isn't that something about Black youth to be monitoring the murder of someone who is very close to your age, and the trial about it? Anyway, so I remember being glued to the television and being shocked as I saw that George Zimmerman was ruled not guilty for second-degree murder. This outrageous miscarriage of justice still leaves tangible scars throughout the Black community. And interestingly, it's translated into various forms of media as well. Multiple rap songs, which has always historically been a way for Black people to voice their grievances at a system, to sort of have rage against the machine, if you will. The rap song "The Box," which was recently like a viral hit by Roddy Ricch, has the lyric, "I done put 100 bands on Zimmerman," meaning that he put a hit out on George Zimmerman. And that sort of goes to talk to the rage that is still boiling for many Black people about George Zimmerman, even 7 or 8 years after this case. So these feelings are still fresh for many people, and their pain is redoubled with each acquittal. So Eric Garner as well, Eric Garner in New York, who was fatally put in a chokehold by a New York police officer for selling loose cigarettes, and said that he could not breathe in the chokehold 11 times before he died on camera. His killers were not, once again acquitted. Same with Breonna Taylor. Her murderers were acquitted as well, receiving charges for endangerment because the bullets they shot through Breonna Taylor's house harmed her white neighbors, or might have harmed her white neighbors. But for the murder in itself, they did not receive charges. Again, for Freddie Gray, for Mike Brown, for so many of these very highly publicized cases, just like becomes a police officer. And that's sort of the rage that Black people often experience when it comes to this lack of recourse. However, there have been significant victories with the Black Lives Matter movement. Not only have they been able to garner broadband support and create a rainbow coalition, if you will, and I think for what many people believe is the first time an international community is paying attention to anti-Black racism. There's new policies and pieces of legislation being introduced every day. Recently, the LAPD has committed to defunding their police and reducing their budgets significantly. In New York, the chokehold that killed Eric Garner has been officially and legislated in different ways. Different police unions throughout are instituting new watchdog policies and adding worn body cameras. And of course, there was lots of work to be done, but I think that part makes me a little bit hopeful. So where does that leave us? I think that leaves us with the understanding that as Black and Indigenous people of color sort of experiencing the Black Lives Matter movement. For me, it's comforting to know that a lot of our struggles have been felt before and they have been won. I think that although there is a lot of difference between how we protest today and how it was done in the 1960s, to know that there are stories of success from our ancestors and from people that look like us, to me, that's inspiring. And to me, as a history major, I'm always looking to the past to sort of understand how things have been done historically and how we can apply that to the future. And I hope that that makes you hopeful as well. So that is about all I have for my presentation today. And I just wanted to open the floor now to any questions that we still have, any lingering feelings, anything that I might have sped through that I could clear up as we go. So I'm just going to stop the screen share here. Internet is freezing up. I am so sorry. Hopefully you caught as much of that as you could. Here I could leave the questions tab still up. And if not, thank you so much for attending. I went straight to the end. If not, thank you so much for attending. Thank you so much for your attention and your participation. Oh, we have one in the Q&A here.
That was excellent. Wow. You have a couple, so you can read them too, right?
Yeah, okay. Do you think representation affects students in schools, and how important is it? I think that representation is super, super, super important. I'm not sure if anyone remembers, I worked at a summer camp when Black Panther was released, and I think it's the anniversary of the day that I went to go see Black Panther myself today, actually. But I remember seeing the children get up and dance, and they were so excited. They were so jittery, running around going, Wakanda forever, Wakanda forever, and just the joy on these Black children's faces. It's easy, the quote that I have for it is sort of, it's easy to imagine yourself as important, as successful, as powerful when you've seen someone else do it. It's easy to accomplish something when you've seen it done and that you know that it is possible. So I think representation is massively important. And I think that it's so important, especially in schools and especially in media, seeing yourself in positions that are honorable, as opposed to being criminal number 2 on the Law and Order episode. Yeah, there's another one here. Do you think there's a disconnect between the African American community and the Caribbean and African communities when it comes to BLM? I think different parts of the Black diaspora sort of understand these movements separately. I remember there was the protest in Nigeria over a branch of their police, and I'm not remembering the name, unfortunately, but there was sort of the idea that some Black Americans felt as though the movement was being co-opted for an experience that wasn't their own, while Black Lives Matter generally would advocate for all Black people. Anti-Blackness is an international system that's been set up hundreds of years ago, and that all people with our skin have to deal with to some capacity. I don't think any Black Lives Matter activists would say only our Black lives matter, at least one that is intellectually honest. What are some next steps and the best way to get involved in change? Great question. There's lots of ways. For me, just finding other like-minded people. I think there's lots of local organizations. Where I live in Bowmanville, there's a Black Lives Matter support group, which is where I found this organization. And after 3 workshops, here I am speaking for them. So I think, which is a great opportunity, and thank you once again to both of you. But I think that there's no wrong way to get involved, as long as you're engaging in Black voices, you are listening to Black people, and you are exploring. It's hard to find a way to go wrong, I think. Canada seems to hide their racism and has swept it under the rug for many years. Do you think these new diversity committees are effective? Depends on the committee. I think we recently saw the Black Lives Matter little scavenger hunt in the Durham region, and it's very easy to be performative. There's this book that I recently saw, and it's about how we fundamentally misunderstand how to talk about race. We think about racism as mean words or mean individual attitudes that people have, as opposed to these structural issues that are much deeper, that are built into our institutions. So having a diverse boardroom does not necessarily mean that these hurdles are being overcome. So it depends on what the committee is. Diversity is the first step, and it cannot be the last step. I realize that I've been bulldozing through all of these, and if either of you had something to add on to any of them.
Yeah, no, I was thinking too about, I think I know you talked a lot about the states in terms of incidents that have happened, but I think the states, because they dominate our media, they dominate the information, it's easy for them to be able to explain all these things that are happening. But what happens within our community is that we don't hear about these events, right? And we forget that these things happen in Canada too. It happens in Ontario, it happens in Durham region. And I think to downplay it takes away from these experiences from our people. And I've experienced over policing, like as you were telling the story about the over policing, I remember a time that I was in Pickering Beach and I had to experience the police in a not very good way. I even applied or even appealed and said, this is not appropriate how they interacted with me. And honestly, to this day, I can't even go to the Pickering Beach without reliving that experience, right? And I've had pastor tell me that, he will not drive down Highway 2 after 12 midnight, even wherever he's coming from. You may be coming from a church service and experiencing, if he's driving down that street, he knows he's getting picked up by the police. I mean, these are real experiences that don't get on the media. They don't talk about it, but these are things that happen within our community. So I appreciate that, but sometimes, yes, we don't see the events that happen in Canada, but it does absolutely happen. What are the tenets do you think is relevant in educational professional context? What tenet of resistance do you think is most relevant in education and professional context?
Oh man, that is a fantastic question. Here, let me just finish typing this in the chat while I ponder a little. I think they're all definitely important. I think it's most important to acknowledge, I think, public humiliation. I think that's a great way to disrupt the stories that are being told. I was recently having a conversation with someone, and they said that they didn't like Black History Month because people have negative reactions to it. And he says that Black History Month creates more racism. And I said the problem there, again, it's the symptom and not the cause. The problem is not the existence of Black History Month. The problem is the lies that you were told the other 11 months of the year, so that when you hit Black History Month, there's this cognitive dissonance. You can't believe what you've been told, and you struggle to accept that you might be complicit in these systems that are harming people. No one wants to think that they're a bad person. No one wants to think that they're harming others. So by disrupting the lies that you are told the other 11 months of the year, maybe that backlash that you get right in February will be diminished.
Wow. That makes sense even too when you're talking about the Durham region incident too around the checklist, right? So I'm sure in June, July, they did some really good work around identifying equity. And then you have this experience where they just backslid 1000%. And now they're doing makeup catch up.
Right.
Lots of
So
acclamations. So do you want to read those?
lots of, pardon?
It's a great presentation. You have such a
Oh,
wealth of
thank you.
knowledge. It's a wonderful to listen to you speak. Thank you very much. Thank you for doing this. This is such an educative experience. The opportunity to learn about Black history. We need this in schools. Yes. What else do we have? Thank you for the quote, the importance of representation. Great presentation, great talk. Keep the discussion going. One of the things that I did a presentation at a high school a couple of days ago, and we talked about representation is really key within the schools. And one of the questions was, you know, I want to hear your opinion. Like, why do you think young people don't necessarily become teachers? What do you think the barriers are, and why did you decide to choose this path?
Oh boy. I think that teaching as a profession, it's sort of, I think that everyone has a negative experience with a teacher that they can pinpoint right away. And I think that the way that teaching is done has changed a lot. I think that when I grew up, the teachers of sort of like the previous generations were, we call them teaching orientations, and they were what we call perennial educators, I think is what we call it in my courses. And those are people who believe that the subject material of their course is the most important thing. You need to understand how to long divide by the end of the course, or else you have failed. And today there's sort of a shift in education towards what's called growth mindset. Growth mindset is the idea that in a classroom, you are only competing against yourself. You are seeking growth always, and all students are always in the act of becoming. In that way, teachers have become therapists. They have become people that teach children emotional regulation. And that's something that I'm interested in sort of teaching like the wholeness of who you are. One of my first teachers, or one of the teachers that wrote me a recommendation to get into my program for teaching, he once said, my job as a teacher is not to give you information, because now we have the internet and there's nothing that you can't learn from the internet. What I can do is teach you that you have potential. And that's what interests me about teaching.
So great chat in the, you know, what do you think? Do you know what school boards will be doing about adding Black history into the curriculum? I want to hear this answer.
Oh, depends on the school board. It's definitely tricky. I've seen efforts to remove To Kill a Mockingbird, for example. I remember that this was one of the first books that I read about Blackness in public education. However, it has a white protagonist by a white author. And I think lots of people who went through public education and had this book read, especially as Black and Indigenous people of color, had the uncomfortable experience of a white teacher saying the N-word as they read it. And while you are teaching about racism, you don't need to do it while harming Black people. You know, like if your activism is harming the people that you are advocating for, you're not doing it right necessarily. I've seen efforts to have like larger committees on diversity. I've seen hiring quotas for Black and Indigenous teachers and teachers from underrepresented communities. I've seen teachers that are very interested in bringing about different resources. Let me just grab it here. I'm sort of building my teacher library now, starting a little bit early. This is one of my favorite examples of representation here. I'm not sure how well you could see it. It's called Don't Touch My Hair by Sherry Miller. And it's just this little story of a little Black girl, how much she loves her hair, and teaching people to stop touching her hair. And it's just sort of the inclusion of stories about race told in such simple ways. If children can internalize, oh, there's a man that zips around the world and gets in your chimney and all that, children have the framework to understand these stories. They understand what unfairness looks like. They grew up with the story of the ugly duckling. They understand what it's like to be looked at differently because of the way you look. Children are capable of understanding these things. It's just you need to start engaging in the conversation as well. negatively affect BIPOC communities in the sense of potentially reducing drug incarcerations. I'm not sure how quantitative my answer will be, just because that's not necessarily my area of expertise. But I think that if we understand drug use as an addiction and a mental health problem, then being punitive about it doesn't make sense. Then to create a system where people are punished and not helped does not make sense. So I think that, and especially in the US, we see lots of cases of thriving companies by people who are starting their marijuana businesses, which is great. Marijuana is legal in several states, but there's also hundreds of thousands of Black people incarcerated for nonviolent drug offenses, and the two cannot exist at the same time. I see in the chat here, Carol says, we showed a film titled Race, Power, and Delusion. Many of the students, faculty, and staff were in shock to learn that white people simply created the term race to disparage Black people with no biological evidence. None of them were even aware that this had happened, so education is so important. I love this one. I think because this is sort of my subject of study. I try and study as much Black content as possible. In one of my earlier classes, they said that it wasn't until around the 1600s that the term Black even came to mean Black people in terms of the color of their skin. There's legal documents from 1500s England where it says the Black man, but referring to a man with brown, dark hair. A white man with brown dark hair, and sort of what it means to be white has also historically changed. You've probably seen those famous signs, no Black, no Irish, or something like that, because different groups of white people have been exempted from whiteness. Spanish people, Mediterranean people, like various groups of whiteness have not been coded as fully white. Jewish people, like these classifications of what race means have changed so much. And there's also the idea that biracial people exist. Some of our most famous Black people have whiteness within them. Trevor Noah, Bob Marley, Malcolm X, all biracial people, but we think of them as exclusively Black. And this just tells us that these concepts of race are invented, and I always try to be careful about that because sometimes they say like they don't mean anything, they're made up. And invented and not real are not the same thing, because race does interact with our lives every day, but they are invented and arbitrary.
Thank you.
I do think we have another comment. It says, based on the US stats, the highest amount of drug users are the same as the BIPOC population. There is a huge stereotype when it comes to drugs and the Black community.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
I think that's what the statistic that the drug use is about the same in both in Black communities as opposed to white communities, but the arrest rates are so much higher because of policies like broken windows policing and only investigating Black communities. The presumption of guilt when it comes to Black people. People are able to see themselves, or white officers are able to see, oh, well, that's like my son, that's like my nephew, that's like my cousin, that's like my friend, when they see a white person. And they don't necessarily feel those feelings of familiarity when they see someone who does not look like them.
Absolutely. I think one of the quote, I'm going back to that movie that I saw, but one of the statement was around, people had really difficult lives back in the 60s and the 70s, and they didn't have any hope. I mean, they couldn't, because of systemic racism. So education or getting, meaningful work or living in really good housing, and having the experience of community violence. And so they felt that they had no other choice but to, mental health was on rise, and addictions were on rise as well. So it makes sense that, addiction became on the rise in those communities because of those experiences, right? So we we don't deny the experience of systemic racism and how it impacts our mental health and our functioning day to day. Any other comments from the community? Any other accolades for this amazing presentation that we were just able to be part of? We hope that you can come again.